My sister blocked the door. On New Year's Eve, sneered, "There's no room here for people like you," and watched my father pour champagne like I was a stranger. So, I went home, cut off every account funding their lives, and 4 days later, my sister was begging. My sister Brielle stood in the doorway of our parents' house at 9:14 p.m. on New Year's Eve and did not move to let me inside. I had driven 2 hours through light snow from my apartment in Madison to get there. The way I drove to every family holiday, the way I had driven to every family holiday for the past 6 years without exception, because showing up was, I had come to believe, the basic price of remaining a person who belonged somewhere. "There's no room here for people like you," Brielle said. She said it lightly, almost playfully, in the tone of someone delivering a line she had clearly rehearsed and was pleased with, loud enough that I knew it was meant to be heard by the people behind her. My father, my stepmother Janine, my 2 younger half-siblings, all visible past Brielle's shoulder in the warm light of the living room, the new sectional couch I had helped pay for 18 months earlier, the television I had also helped pay for, the room generally that I had, in ways none of them fully understood, been quietly subsidizing for years. My father glanced over from where he stood near the kitchen island, champagne bottle in hand, refilling Janine's glass. He looked at me standing in the doorway, looked at Brielle blocking it, and said nothing. He simply continued pouring. I want to describe exactly what that looked like, because the specific quality of his indifference is the detail I have returned to most since that night. He did not defend Brielle's comment. He also did not correct it. He simply treated the entire exchange as background noise to the more pressing task of making sure Janine's glass was properly filled before midnight, the way you might tune out a television playing in another room. I stood in the cold doorway for perhaps 4 seconds, watching my father pour champagne as though I were a stranger who had wandered up to the wrong house. Then I turned around, walked back to my car, and drove home. I did not cry on the drive. I want to be precise about that, because I have thought many times since about what I expected myself to feel and what I actually felt, and they were different things. What I felt was the specific, settling clarity of someone who has just had a suspicion she'd been managing for years finally confirmed completely, with no remaining ambiguity to hide inside. I got home at 11:40 p.m. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open until well past midnight, into the first hours of the new year, and I began, methodically, to undo 6 years of financial decisions that I had never fully examined until that exact moment. My name is Noelle Castile. I'm 34 years old. I'm a senior compliance officer at a regional bank in Madison, Wisconsin, a profession that requires, as a basic function of the job, an extremely precise understanding of where money actually flows versus where people claim it flows, a skill that turned out to be devastatingly relevant to my own family in ways I had simply never applied at home. I need to explain the 6 years, because the doorway moment was not really the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been building, unexamined, since my father's second marriage. My parents divorced when I was 19, the result of a slow erosion rather than any single dramatic event. My father, Walter Castile, remarried 4 years later to Janine, a woman 12 years younger than him with 2 children from a previous relationship, Brielle, who was 16 at the time, and a younger son, Desmond, who was 11. My father and Janine had a daughter together 2 years after the wedding, my half-sister Paloma, who is now 10. I want to be precise about something. I did not resent the blended family on principle. I genuinely tried, across the early years, to build real relationships with Brielle and Desmond, to be a present older sibling rather than a distant one. For a while, it seemed to be working. What I did not fully register, until that New Year's Eve doorway, was the specific financial architecture that had quietly formed around me within the family over the preceding 6 years. An architecture I had built, piece by piece, through a series of individually reasonable-seeming decisions that had, in their cumulative weight, made me the family's primary, unacknowledged financial infrastructure. It started small. When my father's roof needed replacing 4 years ago, a $14,000 repair he genuinely couldn't afford on his own after a difficult stretch following a layoff, I covered it, framing it to myself as a one-time gesture for a father who had raised me, mostly alone, through my own difficult adolescent years before Janine ever entered the picture. The following year, Brielle needed help with a security deposit and first month's rent for her first apartment, $2,800, which I covered directly, again framing it as a one-time gesture, this time toward a younger stepsister I genuinely wanted to support as she started her adult life. What I did not notice, because each individual decision felt isolated and reasonable in the moment, was that these one-time gestures had quietly compounded into a standing pattern. By the time of that New Year's Eve, I was covering, on a recurring basis, $380 a month toward my father and Janine's car insurance, which I had agreed to help with temporarily 2 years earlier during another rough financial stretch, and had simply never stopped. $215 a month toward Brielle's phone plan, on a family plan I had originally set up just until she got established, and a $500 monthly transfer to my father directly, which had started as occasional help and had become, over 18 months, an assumed standing arrangement that nobody in the family, including me, had ever actually discussed or formally agreed to in clear terms. The total I discovered when I finally sat down and added every recurring commitment together that New Year's night came to $1,295 a month, $13,140 a year. Across the full 6 years since the roof repair first began the pattern, including the larger one-time contributions, the total came to approximately $96,800, nearly $100,000 given gradually, unexamined, to a family that had just told me at the front door on a holiday that there was no room for people like me. The first sign that something specific was wrong, beyond the general slow drift of the financial pattern, had come about 4 months before New Year's Eve, during a phone call with my father about an unrelated topic. He had mentioned, almost casually, that Brielle and her boyfriend Marcus were doing really well, and had recently put down a deposit on a nicer apartment, a detail he shared with evident pride, the specific pride of a father describing a child's independent success. I remember feeling a small, strange dissonance at the time, because I was, at that exact moment, still the one paying $215 a month toward Brielle's phone bill, a fact my father either did not know or had simply stopped registering as connected to Brielle's overall financial picture. I let it go. I want to be honest about that. I noticed the dissonance and chose not to examine it, because examining it would have required a conversation I did not want to have during what was, at the time, a pleasant phone call. The second sign came 2 months before New Year's Eve at Thanksgiving, when Brielle made a comment, lighter than the doorway comment, but in retrospect clearly related to it, about how I always made things weird by bringing up money, after I had asked, gently, whether the family planned to address the car insurance arrangement that had now been running for over 2 years, without ever being formally discussed. "It's not a big deal," she'd said. "You make more than all of us combined anyway." I had not, at that point, fully calculated what the big deal actually was in dollar terms. I let the comment pass. The third sign, the one I should have understood as a direct preview of the doorway, came 3 weeks before New Year's Eve, when I learned, through Desmond, rather than through any direct conversation with my father or Brielle, that the family had been planning a fresh start for the new year that involved Brielle and Marcus moving in with my father and Janine temporarily while they saved for a house, an arrangement that, Desmond mentioned without apparently realizing the implication, made way more sense now that Dad doesn't really need Noelle's help with the bills the way he used to. I asked Desmond what he meant by that. He said, with the specific, unguarded honesty of a younger sibling who hasn't yet learned to manage information carefully, that Brielle had told their mother, a few months earlier, that the family didn't really need to keep including me in things the way they had, now that things were more stable, and that some of the family's calculations going forward assumed my financial contributions would simply continue regardless of how I was treated, because, as Brielle had apparently put it, she's not going to just stop helping. That's not who she is. I sat with that information for 3 weeks before New Year's Eve. I did not act on it immediately because I wanted to see, with real clarity rather than secondhand information, exactly how the family would actually treat me when given the opportunity. The doorway gave me the clarity I needed. What I did, sitting at my kitchen table past midnight on New Year's Day, was methodical rather than impulsive, in the specific way that someone with my professional training approaches a problem once she has finally allowed herself to see it clearly. I canceled the $380 monthly car insurance contribution first, logging directly into the joint arrangement I had set up through my own bank's automatic bill pay system, which I had administrative control over because I had originally set up the payment. I removed myself from Brielle's family phone plan second, a process that required a call to the carrier the following morning, January 1st, where I formally requested that my payment method be removed and that the plan revert to requiring payment directly from the remaining account holders. I canceled the standing $500 monthly transfer to my father third, the simplest cancellation of the 3, requiring only a few clicks in my own bank's transfer settings. I want to describe what I felt doing this because I think it matters. I did not feel vindictive. I felt instead the specific sober clarity of someone correcting a structural error she had allowed to persist for 6 years, because correcting it would have required a conversation she had been avoiding. The doorway had simply removed every reason left to keep avoiding it. I did not call anyone to announce what I had done. I did not send an angry text. I simply stopped and let the natural consequences of stopping become apparent on their own timeline. The car insurance lapsed first, within 3 days, when my father's insurer sent a notice that the policy would be canceled for non-payment unless the balance was settled immediately. A balance that included not just my portion, but the full payment, since I had been covering it directly rather than simply contributing my share to an account my father then forwarded. My father called me on January 3rd, sounding genuinely confused rather than angry, asking whether there had been some kind of bank error with the insurance payment. "There's no error," I said. "I canceled the automatic payment." A long pause. "Why would you do that without telling anyone?" he said. "Dad," I said, "I stood in the doorway of your house 4 days ago while Brielle told me there was no room for people like me, and you poured champagne and didn't say a word. I'm not interested in continuing to fund a household that just told me I don't belong in it." He was quiet for a long moment. "That was just Brielle being Brielle," he said. "You know how she gets." "I know exactly how she gets," I said. "I've known for years. What I didn't fully understand until that exact moment was that you were never going to do anything about it, no matter how she treated me, as long as I kept paying for things. So I've stopped paying for things. You can decide what kind of relationship relationship we have now without that as the foundation. He did not have a response to that. Brielle's phone was suspended on January 4th, the carrier's standard procedure once a payment method is removed, and the account holders fail to provide an alternative within the grace period. A fact I learned only because Desmond texted me, somewhat alarmed, asking why Brielle was freaking out about her phone not working. Brielle called me from Marcus's phone on January 5th, 4 days after I had begun unwinding the arrangement, in a state I can only describe, having reviewed my own memory of the call many times since, as genuine panic rather than performance. "I don't understand what's happening," she said. "Dad's insurance got canceled, my phone is off, and now Marcus is saying we might not be able to do the apartment thing because the numbers don't work without—" She stopped herself. "Without what?" I said. "Without the stuff you've been helping with," she said quietly. I let that sit in the silence for a moment, because I wanted her to actually hear herself say it. "4 days ago," I said, "you blocked your own father's doorway and told me there was no room here for people like me. Now you're calling me from your boyfriend's phone because the room you didn't want me in turns out to have been built, in part, by money I was sending. Can you understand why those two things don't fit together?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't think about it that way. I was just—" She stopped again. "You were just what?" I said. "I was just trying to look good in front of Janine's side of the family," she said finally, with something that sounded like real shame underneath it. "They were all there, and I wanted to seem like I had it together. Like you didn't need me." I said. "Yeah," she said. "I want to be honest about what happened next, because it is not a tidy resolution, and I don't think tidy resolutions are usually honest ones. I did not restore any of the 3 financial arrangements. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's the single most important decision in this entire story, and the one I am most certain, even now, was correct. I told Brielle on that call that I was willing to have an actual relationship with her, one not built on money, one where she would need to actually treat me like a sister, rather than an inconvenient financial resource she occasionally had to publicly disown for social comfort, but that the specific financial arrangements were over permanently, regardless of how the conversation went. She cried. I believe the crying was genuine, though I also believe it was, in part, about the practical consequences rather than purely about how she had treated me. Both things can be true simultaneously, and I have stopped needing to fully untangle which proportion was which. My father and Janine resolved the insurance lapse themselves within the week, taking out a smaller, more basic policy they could actually afford on their own income. A policy that, I learned later through Desmond, cost them considerably more per month than my contribution had been covering because they no longer qualified for the multi-vehicle discount the larger policy had included. Brielle and Marcus's apartment plans fell through. They stayed in my father's house for an additional 8 months before finding something within their actual combined income, a modest 1-bedroom across town, considerably smaller than what they had been planning with my unacknowledged subsidy built into the math. My father and I have spoken several times since, conversations that are, I will say honestly, more careful and more limited than they once were. He has not apologized directly for the doorway exactly. He has instead offered a version of an apology that acknowledges he should have said something, without quite reaching the deeper acknowledgement of why he hadn't, for years, ever felt the need to. I have decided, with my own therapist's guidance, that this partial acknowledgement is something I can work with, slowly, rather than something I need to reject entirely. I have been in therapy since January, with a therapist named Dr. Renata Akinola, who focuses specifically on financial dynamics in blended families, a specialty I did not know existed until I needed it. She asked me in an early session, "What do you think you were actually purchasing with 6 years of unexamined financial support?" I thought about that for a long time. "A place at the table," I said, literally and otherwise. I believed, somewhere underneath all the individual, reasonable-seeming decisions, that if I stopped contributing, I would simply cease to have a claim to belong there at all, so I never stopped. I never even let myself look at the total. "And what did you learn?" she asked, "when you finally did stop and finally did look? That the belonging was never actually connected to the money in the first place," I said. "It just felt that way because nobody had ever tested it directly until that doorway forced the test. Brielle and I have dinner now, every 6 weeks or so, somewhere modest, where we split the bill evenly without either of us making a point of it. It is slower than the relationship we had before, in terms of warmth. It is also, I believe, the first version of our relationship that has ever been entirely real, built on whatever genuine affection actually exists between us, rather than on the specific, comfortable architecture of money I had spent 6 years building, without ever once stepping back to look at what I had actually constructed. I think about the doorway often, about my father pouring champagne, about the specific stillness of that moment, and how 4 days were all it took, once I finally stopped, for the entire unexamined structure to reveal exactly what it had actually been holding up the whole time. It was never holding up a family. It was holding up an arrangement that had been mistaken, by everyone including me, for one.